Title: I time traveled 10 years ahead, have a child who fears me, and my husband isn't my dream man. Chapter 1: A Future I Don't Remember. A sharp headache tore through my skull as I slowly blinked my eyes open. The room around me was dimly lit, unfamiliar, and smelled faintly of lavender. My body felt oddly sore, like I had been asleep for days. Before I could sit up, a small gasp echoed beside me. "Mom." I turned my head slowly, and my breath hitched. A little boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old, stood beside my bed, his wide, brown eyes filled with hesitation. His tiny hands clenched the hem of his oversized pajama shirt, his lips slightly parted as if he wanted to say more but didn't dare. "Mom?" No, that wasn't right. I wasn't a mother. I was just a university student. Yesterday, was it really just yesterday, I had accepted my crush's confession. We had been sitting under the cherry blossom trees on campus, laughing and talking about our future. So how was it possible that I was waking up in this strange room, being called Mom, by a child I had never seen before? I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to work. Who? Before I could finish my question, the boy flinched and took a step back, his little hands trembling. His reaction made my chest tighten. Why did he look so afraid? A noise from outside the door startled both of us. The boy quickly wiped his eyes with his sleeve and lowered his head. I'll go tell Dad you're awake," he mumbled before scurrying out of the room. "Dad?" I shot up in bed, my heart racing. I have a child. And a husband? My gaze darted around the unfamiliar room. The walls were painted a muted gray, decorated with minimalist artwork. A sleek, modern desk stood in the corner, neatly arranged with documents and a closed laptop. On the nightstand beside me, a framed wedding photo sat beside a digital alarm clock blinking 7:42 a.m. I reached for the photo, my hands trembling. The bride was me. The same dark hair, the same familiar features. But the groom standing beside me wasn't my crush. A cold chill ran down my spine as I stared at the unfamiliar man in the picture. He had sharp features, dark eyes that held a piercing intensity, and a presence that somehow felt both commanding and distant. Who was he? And why was I married to him? Before I could process the thought, heavy footsteps echoed outside the door. A deep, steady voice followed, sending an involuntary shiver down my spine. "She's awake?" The door handle turned. I held my breath. The future I had woken up in was about to come crashing down on me. The door swung open. A tall man stepped inside, his figure casting a long shadow across the room. He was dressed in a crisp white shirt with the top button undone, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing strong forearms. His dark eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my breath hitch. I knew, in that instant, that this was the man in the wedding photo. He studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. His face held no trace of warmth, no hint of relief at seeing his wife awake. "You're finally up," he said, his voice deep and calm, too calm. I clutched the blanket in my lap, my mind racing. What am I supposed to say? I had no memory of him, no idea how I had ended up in this life. His gaze flickered to the nightstand, where the wedding photo still lay in my trembling hands. His jaw tightened. "You don't remember, do you?" His words sent a sharp chill down my spine. He knew. He could tell. I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady. "Who are you?" For a fleeting second, something flashed in his eyes, something I couldn't decipher. But it disappeared just as quickly, replaced by a cold, emotionless mask. I'm your husband, Adrian Sinclair. The name meant nothing to me. No recognition. No familiarity. I gripped the blanket tighter, my nails digging into the fabric. And, that boy? My voice wavered as I glanced toward the door, where the child had disappeared moments ago. His expression didn't change. Ethan. Our son. Our son. A wave of dizziness hit me. I have a son. A husband I don't remember. A life I never lived. I shook my head. This has to be a dream. It doesn't make sense. Just yesterday, I was. Yesterday? Adrian cut in, his voice eerily controlled. Yesterday was 10 years ago. His words crashed over me like a tidal wave, drowning me in panic. No. No, this wasn't real. It couldn't be. I reached for my phone, desperate for some proof, some explanation. My fingers fumbled as I pressed the power button. The lock screen lit up. February 16, 2035. I nearly dropped the phone. My stomach twisted into knots. This isn't possible. Adrian watched me carefully, his gaze sharp and calculating. You really don't remember anything, do you? I looked up at him, my breathing shallow. No, I whispered. I don't. For a moment, there was silence. Then, his lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. It was cold, knowing, almost amused. Then I guess, he said, stepping closer, we have a lot to catch up on. Chapter 2, The Boy Who Calls Me Mom. I gripped the blanket tighter as Adrian's words sank in. We have a lot to catch up on. Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. I need a moment, I said quickly, my voice barely above a whisper. Adrian's gaze lingered on me for a second before he turned away. Take your time. But we'll talk later. With that, he walked out, shutting the door behind him with a quiet click. The moment he left, I let out a shaky breath. My pulse was racing. My hands trembled as I stared at the phone screen again. February 16, 2035. I tapped on the screen, and the phone unlocked, no password required. A familiar face stared back at me from the wallpaper. It was me, but older. My hair was slightly longer, my features more mature. Standing beside me in the photo was Ethan, the little boy who had called me Mom. I hesitated, then opened the gallery. Hundreds of photos. Some of me and Ethan. Some of Adrian. Some of us together, like a real family. But no matter how many I swiped through, none of them sparked a single memory. I felt like an imposter in my own life. A soft knock at the door snapped me out of my thoughts. I turned just as Ethan peeked in, his big brown eyes hesitant. His small hands gripped the edge of the doorframe. He looked nervous. Afraid, even. The sight made my heart clench. Can I come in? He asked quietly. I swallowed and forced a smile. Of course. He stepped in slowly, standing awkwardly a few feet away from the bed, as if unsure of how close he was allowed to be. For a few seconds, we just stared at each other. What was I supposed to say? I had no idea how to be a mother. And clearly, he wasn't sure how to act around me either. Ethan shifted on his feet before speaking again, his voice small. Are you still mad at me? The question threw me off guard. My brows furrowed. Mad? Why would I be mad at you? He hesitated, chewing on his lip. Because, last night, you said you didn't want to see me. My breath caught. What? I shook my head immediately. I don't remember saying that. He looked up at me, searching my face. You really don't remember anything, do you? I exhaled, shaking my head. No. His tiny hands clenched into fists. Does that mean you don't remember why you? He stopped mid-sentence, looking down at the floor. Never mind. I opened my mouth to ask, but before I could, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded paper. He placed it on the nightstand beside me and took a step back. It's your schedule, he mumbled. So you don't forget stuff. My schedule? I reached for the paper and unfolded it. My chest tightened at the sight. The neat, careful handwriting. The childish doodles in the corners. It was written by Ethan. Monday, pick me up at 4 p.m. after school. Tuesday, dinner at 7 p.m., we can eat together if you want. Wednesday, no work. Maybe we can go to the park. Thursday. The list continued. The further I read, the harder it became to swallow. There were little notes, reminders for myself to spend time with him. As if I constantly forgot. Had I really been that kind of mother? My grip tightened on the paper as guilt twisted in my chest. Ethan, I said softly. He tensed, looking up at me with those same wary eyes. Like he expected me to yell at him. I swallowed past the lump in my throat. Do I usually forget things? He didn't answer right away. Then, slowly, he nodded. Yeah, he whispered. A heavy silence fell between us. I wanted to say something, anything, to reassure him. But the words caught in my throat. What kind of mother was I before I lost my memories? And more importantly, what had I done to make my own child afraid of me? Chapter 3, A Mother He's Afraid of. Ethan stood there, waiting. For what? I wasn't sure. Maybe for me to scold him, maybe for me to dismiss him like I apparently had so many times before. But I wasn't that person. At least, I didn't remember being that person. I took a slow breath and folded the schedule carefully before placing it back on the nightstand. Ethan, I started softly, can you tell me what I was like? He tensed, his fingers gripping the hem of his shirt. You were, he hesitated, his little shoulders drawing in as if afraid to say the wrong thing. You were always really busy. That didn't sound too bad. But then he added, and you never smiled at me. My heart clenched. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Never smiled at him? Not even once? I wanted to deny it, tell him he must be mistaken. But the way he looked at me, hopeful, yet wary, like a child who had learned that love could be conditional, it made me realize he was telling the truth. My throat felt tight. Did I swallowed. Did I ever hurt you? His eyes widened slightly before he quickly shook his head. No. You never hit me or anything. Relief flooded through me, briefly. But, his voice grew smaller. Sometimes, when I tried to talk to you, you just walked past me. Like you didn't hear me. Like I wasn't there. The words were like a punch to the gut. I bit my lip, my chest aching. I had never thought of myself as a cold person. But if what Ethan was saying was true, who had I become over these last 10 years? I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but at that moment, the bedroom door swung open. Adrian walked in. His sharp gaze landed on Ethan first, then flickered to me. It's late. Go to bed. For a moment, Ethan hesitated. He looked at me, his expression unreadable, before nodding. Okay. He turned to leave, his little footsteps silent on the wooden floor. I felt a sudden urge to stop him. To pull him into a hug. To apologize for whatever kind of mother I had been. But I didn't move. Because how could I apologize for something I didn't remember doing? The door clicked shut behind him, leaving me alone with Adrian. I glanced at him warily. Unlike Ethan, Adrian didn't seem nervous around me. He stood tall, arms crossed, watching me with an unreadable expression. Finally, he spoke. So, what exactly do you remember? I hesitated, gripping the sheets beneath my fingers. Nothing. The last thing I remember was, I paused. Yesterday. His brow furrowed. Yesterday, he repeated. I nodded. I was 18. I had just accepted a confession from someone I liked. And then, I exhaled, shaking my head. Then I woke up here. 10 years later. Adrian didn't react right away. He simply studied me, his gaze sharp. Calculating. Then he said, Who? I blinked. What? His jaw tightened slightly. Who confessed to you? I frowned. Why did that matter? A classmate. What was his name? There was something in his tone, something almost dangerous. I hesitated. Daniel. A long silence. Adrian's face remained unreadable, but his knuckles whitened slightly where he had his arms crossed. For some reason, I had the feeling that name wasn't new to him. But before I could ask, he turned away. Get some rest. We'll talk more tomorrow. Then, just like that, he left the room. I was left sitting there, confused and uneasy. One thing was clear. Adrian knew something. And if I wanted answers, I needed to find out who I had been these past 10 years, and why my own child feared me. Chapter 4, The Name He Hates. The silence in the room felt heavy even after Adrian left. Daniel. Why did that name make him react like that? I shifted in bed, my heart still racing. There was something off about Adrian, something calculated about the way he looked at me, as if he were expecting something from me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something big. And if I wanted to find out what, I had to start with him. The next morning. Sunlight streamed through the curtains when I woke up. The house was eerily silent, but I could hear faint noises downstairs, probably Adrian or the maids moving around. After freshening up, I cautiously stepped out of my room. The house, our house, apparently, was huge. Everything was modern, sleek, and expensive. It didn't feel like me at all. I made my way downstairs and spotted Adrian sitting at the dining table. A cup of coffee rested in front of him, and he was reading something on his phone. He didn't acknowledge me at first. But the moment I sat down, he spoke without looking up. You remember Daniel, he said. It wasn't a question. I swallowed. I remember accepting his confession. But nothing after that. Adrian finally set his phone down and met my gaze. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were cold. You loved him, he said. The words sent a jolt through me. Loved? I barely had time to process that before he continued. You loved him so much that you ran away with him. My breath hitched. What? Adrian leaned back in his chair, his gaze sharp. You don't remember that part? I shook my head, my pulse pounding. I don't remember anything after accepting his confession. A humorless chuckle left his lips. How convenient. I frowned. Why would I run away with Daniel? Adrian's jaw tightened. Because you thought he was your dream man. The way he said it, mocking, bitter, sent shivers down my spine. I opened my mouth to argue, but then, a sudden flash. It wasn't much. Just a flicker of memory. A younger me, standing in the rain. Holding someone's hand. A voice whispering, no matter what happens, we'll always be together. My head throbbed. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to grasp onto the memory, but it was gone as quickly as it came. Adrian was watching me carefully. Something wrong? I inhaled sharply. I think I remembered something. But it's blurry. His expression darkened. You'll remember soon enough, he said. The way he said it sent a chill down my spine. What had happened between me, Daniel, and Adrian? And why did it feel like I was about to uncover something I wasn't ready for? Chapter 5, A Deal with the Devil. Adrian's words haunted me all morning. You loved him so much that you ran away with him. But if that were true, why wasn't I with Daniel now? Why was I married to Adrian instead? The questions gnawed at me as I wandered through the house. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. I found my way to what looked like a home office. The air smelled like old paper and expensive cologne. A large desk sat in the center, neatly organized, except for a single drawer that was slightly ajar. Something inside me whispered that I'd find something important there. I hesitated, glancing toward the door. No one was around. Slowly, I pulled the drawer open. Inside, I found a stack of documents, contracts, letters, and a few old photographs. And then, I saw it. A marriage certificate. My name. Adrian's name. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages. And that's when I found something even worse, a contract. I read the words carefully, my heart pounding. In exchange for financial and legal assistance, the undersigned agrees to a legally binding marriage between Adrian Blackwood and Evelyn Carter, effective immediately. What the hell? My stomach twisted. This wasn't a normal marriage. This was a transaction. My breathing quickened as I scanned through the fine print. Then, at the bottom of the page, Daniel's signature. I froze. Chapter 6, The Night I Was Sold. My hands trembled as I clutched the contract. Daniel sold you to me. Adrian's words echoed in my head, but I couldn't accept them. There had to be something more, something I was missing. My heart pounded as a dull ache formed in my temples. And then, a flash. Dark rain-soaked streets. The sound of footsteps, hurried, desperate. I could hear my own voice. Daniel, tell me the truth. Why are we here? I saw myself standing under a flickering streetlight, rain pouring down my face, my hands clutching onto Daniel's coat as if my life depended on it. And Daniel. He looked broken. His usually warm eyes were shadowed with something I couldn't understand. His jaw was clenched so tight it looked painful. He didn't answer me right away. Instead, he exhaled shakily, then looked over his shoulder, toward a black car parked near the alley. I followed his gaze. The back door opened, and Adrian stepped out. My pulse spiked. Adrian had been there that night. The memory pulled me in deeper. Why is he here? My past self demanded, voice shaking. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment before finally speaking. Eve. I have no choice. My stomach dropped. No choice. The rain pounded harder as Adrian took a slow step forward. He was wearing a black suit, his presence commanding even in the dim glow of the streetlights. His gaze locked onto me. "Get in the car, Evelyn," he said. I took a step back. "No." Daniel flinched. "Eve, please, just listen." "Listen to what?" My voice cracked. "Why is he telling me to get in his car? Why are you looking at me like that?" Daniel's face twisted in anguish. "I lost everything," he whispered. His words sent a chill down my spine. I didn't understand. Adrian exhaled sharply, his patience wearing thin. "You can explain later. We have a deal, remember?" Daniel's fists clenched, but he nodded. "A deal?" I took another step back. "No. No way. I don't know what's going on, but I'm not getting in that car." Daniel grabbed my wrist, too tight. "I need you to trust me." His voice was pained, desperate. "This is the only way." "The only way, for what?" I fought against his grip. "Daniel, let me go." But before I could run, Adrian's voice cut through the night like a blade. "If you don't come with me, your parents will go to prison." Everything stopped. My entire body went cold. I turned slowly. What?" Adrian's face was unreadable, but his words were merciless. "Your father is drowning in debt. Your mother forged documents to protect him. If I pull back my legal team, they'll both be arrested by tomorrow morning." My breath hitched. I turned to Daniel. "Tell me he's lying." But Daniel wouldn't meet my eyes. The silence was louder than any answer. Tears blurred my vision as realization hit me like a truck. I wasn't just sold. I was sacrificed. By the two people I trusted most. Adrian stepped closer, his voice eerily calm. "The choice is yours, Evelyn." I was shaking. Daniel looked like he wanted to die. But in the end, I got in the car. Chapter 7, A Cage with No Escape. I jolted awake, drenched in sweat. The memory of that night clung to me like a nightmare I couldn't shake. Daniel's broken expression. The rain. Adrian's cold voice. "If you don't come with me, your parents will go to prison." My chest tightened. My parents. Did they even know what I sacrificed for them? I buried my face in my hands, trying to steady my breathing, but the weight of betrayal pressed down on me like a crushing tide. Daniel had given me away. Adrian had taken me. And my own family had let it happen. I was utterly alone. I barely left my room that day. Adrian didn't bother me. Neither did the child who was supposedly my son. I was grateful for that. I wasn't ready to face either of them. I didn't trust them. I didn't trust anyone. The sun was setting by the time I forced myself to leave the room. The house was eerily silent, except for the occasional creak of the wooden floors beneath my bare feet. I wandered aimlessly, trying to make sense of this place, of this life that apparently belonged to me. At the end of the hallway, I found myself standing in front of a slightly open door. Inside, I could hear the faint sound of pages turning. Curiosity got the best of me. I peeked inside. The little boy, my son, sat curled up on a chair, reading a picture book. A lump formed in my throat. He looked so small. So innocent. But when I took a tiny step forward, he immediately flinched. I froze. His tiny hands gripped the book tighter as his big, round eyes darted to me, filled with hesitation. Like he was afraid of me. I took a step back. "I won't," my voice cracked, and I swallowed hard. "I won't hurt you." He didn't say anything. Instead, He lowered his head, staring at the book as if it could somehow protect him. Something sharp twisted in my chest. What kind of mother had I been, to make my own child fear me? I turned on my heel and walked away. That night, I sat by the window, staring at the city lights in the distance. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was trapped. Not just in this house, but in a life I didn't understand. A life I didn't choose. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass, trying to steady my thoughts. I needed answers. I needed to remember everything. But most of all, I needed to find a way out. Because if there was one thing I knew for sure, it was this. I would never trust Adrian. And I would never forgive Daniel. Chapter 8, The Distance Between Us. I kept my distance. For 3 days, I barely left my room except to eat. Even then, I made sure the dining room was empty before I stepped out. The house was too big, yet it felt suffocating. The marble floors gleamed under the dim lighting, and the high ceilings made my footsteps echo louder than I wanted them to. I avoided him. And I avoided the boy. It wasn't that I hated the child. I just didn't know how to look at him. He was proof of a life I didn't remember. Proof that I had changed into someone I didn't recognize. And worst of all, he feared me. Every time I saw him, his small hands would clutch the fabric of his clothes, his big eyes filled with hesitation, like he expected me to lash out at him. What had I done in these missing 10 years to make my own child afraid of me? I wasn't ready to find out. The fourth night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, arms wrapped around my legs, staring blankly at the city lights beyond the glass. Then, there was a knock at my door. I stiffened. I knew who it was even before he spoke. Evelyn. Adrian's voice was calm, but there was an underlying edge to it. I didn't respond. The doorknob twisted. Locked. A sigh. Then, his voice came again, lower, controlled. Are you planning to avoid me forever? My throat tightened. I didn't owe him an answer. Silence stretched between us. Then, his tone sharpened. And our son? You've been ignoring him too. Our son. The words sent a bitter chill down my spine. I slowly stood, my hands curling into fists. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I stepped toward the door, resting my palm against the cold wood between us. 1,000 things I wanted to say churned in my mind. You stole my life. You forced me into this. Why did my son flinch when he saw me? But when I finally spoke, my voice came out quiet, almost hollow. I don't know him. A pause. Then, Adrian's voice softened. Then get to know him. I let out a short, bitter laugh. Just like that? Adrian didn't answer immediately. You're not the same as before, he finally said, his voice steady. But you're still his mother. I swallowed hard. And you? What am I to you? This time, Adrian didn't answer at all. The silence stretched so long that I thought he had left. Then, click. My heart stopped as the doorknob twisted again. This time, it turned freely. My blood ran cold. I had locked it. Adrian had a key. The door pushed open, revealing him standing in the dim hallway. The golden glow of the lights cast shadows across his face, making his sharp features even more unreadable. He stepped inside. Instinctively, I took a step back. His gaze flickered, his jaw tightening for the briefest second, like he noticed. Then, he exhaled and closed the door behind him. You act like I'm a stranger. I clenched my fists. Aren't you? He studied me in silence, his dark eyes unreadable. Then, instead of answering, he did something that made my breath catch. He took a step closer. I tensed. But Adrian didn't reach for me. He just stood there, watching me carefully, measuring my reaction. Then, finally, he spoke. Are you afraid of me? I opened my mouth, then hesitated. Was I? I hated him. I resented him. But fear? I wasn't sure. So I didn't answer. Instead, I turned away, crossing my arms tightly over my chest. Just leave, I muttered. Adrian was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, he sighed. Tomorrow, he said. I frowned, glancing back at him. Tomorrow what? You're having breakfast with our son. My stomach twisted. I never agreed to that. You didn't have to, Adrian said simply. It's not a request. And with that, he turned and left, shutting the door behind him. I stood frozen, my heartbeat hammering against my ribs. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor. Breakfast with my son. A child who looked at me like I was a monster. A child who had every reason to fear me, even if I didn't know why. I wasn't ready. But deep down, I knew something. I needed to be. If I wanted answers, if I wanted to uncover the truth of what had happened to me, I had to stop running. Even if it meant facing the past I wasn't sure I wanted to remember. Tomorrow, I would sit across from my son for the first time. And maybe, just maybe, I'd start to understand the person I had become. Chapter 9, A Table Between Us. The morning of the meeting. The smell of fresh toast and scrambled eggs filled the air, but my stomach churned with unease. I stood outside the dining room, my fingers clenching the doorframe. I wasn't ready. But Adrian's words from last night echoed in my mind. You're having breakfast with our son. It's not a request. With a slow breath, I stepped inside. The room was bright with sunlight filtering through the large windows, casting a golden glow over the long dining table. And there he was. Sitting stiffly on the far end, feet barely touching the floor, was the little boy. My son. His small hands rested on his lap, and his gaze flickered toward me before immediately darting away. His grip on his spoon tightened, his knuckles turning white. He was nervous. No, he was scared. I swallowed hard. Did he really think I would? No. I had to fix this. 2. The tension of silence. I forced myself to walk forward, feeling like I was stepping onto a battlefield. The chair across from him was already pulled out, like someone had prepared it for me. I hesitated before lowering myself onto the seat. Silence. He kept his head down, stirring his food without eating. I cleared my throat. Morning. He flinched. A flinch. Something sharp twisted in my chest. What had I done to him in these missing 10 years? I quickly lowered my voice. Did you sleep well? He nodded, barely. I exhaled, trying again. The food looks good. Nothing. He just sat there, silent, like he was afraid to say the wrong thing. The weight of the moment pressed down on me, and I realized something. This wasn't just awkward. This was years of damage. He wasn't just uncomfortable with me. He had been conditioned to be. By me. Chapter 9, A Table Between Us, Part 2. 3. The Weight of the Past. I stared at the little boy in front of me, my son. My child. Yet, In this moment, we felt like strangers. He kept his head lowered, eyes focused on the plate in front of him, stirring his food without taking a bite. His tiny fingers trembled slightly, and I hated the way my presence seemed to suffocate him. Had I always been like this to him? Had every meal felt this tense, this suffocating? A memory flickered, dim and unclear, but there. You should be grateful. I don't have time for nonsense. Stop crying. It's annoying. Go to your room. The voice was mine. Cold. Distant. I clenched my fists under the table. Was that who I had become? A mother's hesitation. I picked up my fork, pretending not to notice how he stiffened when I moved. My chest felt tight, but I forced a gentle smile. You like eggs? I asked, trying to sound casual. He hesitated before giving a small nod. My fingers curled around my fork. How long had he been this hesitant with me? I wanted to ask more, to apologize, to fix the unspoken wounds between us, but where would I even begin? Instead, I tried something smaller. I reached for the pitcher of orange juice and poured some into his glass. Here, I murmured. He froze. His hands clenched into small fists, and for a moment, I thought he was going to push the glass away. But then, slowly, hesitantly, he reached for it. His small fingers wrapped around the cup, and he brought it to his lips. A small sip. My breath caught in my throat. It was such a simple thing, but to me, it felt monumental. A crack in the walls between us. I didn't realize I had been holding my breath until he set the glass down. You always drink coffee, he muttered. My heart skipped. It was the first time he had spoken directly to me since I sat down. I blinked. I do? He gave another small nod. You never drink juice. You say it's too sweet. Something about the way he said it made my chest ache. I had been so predictable to him, and yet I knew nothing about him. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but before I could, a deep voice cut through the tension. Adrian's presence. You're early. I turned toward the doorway. Adrian stood there, leaning against the frame, arms crossed over his chest. His dark eyes flicked between me and our son. The unreadable expression on his face sent a shiver down my spine. Had he been watching us? I looked away, trying to ignore the way his gaze felt like it was peeling back every layer of my uncertainty. He strode into the room, settling into the seat at the head of the table. Did you eat? His question wasn't directed at me. Our son quickly shook his head. Adrian glanced at the plate. Then eat. There was no harshness in his tone, yet it held an undeniable authority. The boy obeyed immediately, picking up his spoon and taking a bite. I felt a strange mixture of relief and unease. Adrian had influence over him. I, on the other hand, did not. A silent battle. I forced myself to eat, but I could feel Adrian's gaze lingering on me. I knew what he was thinking. You're avoiding me. You're avoiding him. And he was right. Because how was I supposed to look him in the eyes and pretend everything was normal? How was I supposed to act like I belonged here when I didn't even recognize myself in this life? But most of all, how was I supposed to be a mother to a child who feared me? Final chapter, A Path to Redemption. I, confronting the past. The sun had long set, casting a dim glow over the grand estate. I stood alone in the hallway, staring at the framed family portrait hanging on the wall. There we were, Adrian, our son, and me. I looked happy. Or at least, I had pretended to be. The woman in the photo wasn't me. She was someone else, someone colder, someone distant. I touched the glass lightly, my reflection merging with hers. How did I become this person? A rush of memories flooded back. The night I lost everything, the deal that bound me to Adrian, the slow unraveling of my love for Daniel, the betrayal that forced me into this marriage. Adrian had taken me away from my dreams, from my first love, but had he really been my enemy? Or had he been the only one who saw the truth? 2. Adrian's revelation. Footsteps echoed behind me. I was waiting for you to remember, Adrian said softly. I turned to face him. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held something I hadn't noticed before, regret. Waiting for me to remember what? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He exhaled slowly. The truth. I swallowed hard. That you forced me into this life? That I was supposed to marry Daniel? Adrian's jaw clenched. Daniel never loved you. The words hit me like a slap. He stepped closer. He sold you to me, Evelyn. I felt the ground shift beneath me. Liar. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. Then read this. With trembling hands, I took it. It was a contract. Signed by Daniel. I, Daniel Whitmore, willingly relinquish all claims to Evelyn Carter in exchange for financial compensation. I couldn't breathe. Daniel, my first love, the man I had mourned, the person I had built my fantasies around, had sold me. Tears welled in my eyes as I slowly crumpled the paper. Adrian watched me carefully. I tried to tell you before, but you wouldn't listen. You hated me too much to see the truth. I laughed bitterly. And you think forcing me to marry you was the right thing to do? No, he admitted. But it was the only way to protect you. I shook my head, my chest aching. From what? He hesitated. Then, his voice dropped. From yourself. The final choice. The weight of his words settled deep in my bones. I had spent so long trapped in a fantasy, clinging to a love that had never been real, resenting a man who had never truly been my enemy. And in doing so, I had hurt the only person who truly needed me, our son. I turned away from Adrian and walked toward the door. Where are you going? He asked. I looked back at him, my heart heavy but my mind clear for the first time. To fix what I broke, I whispered. And with that, I stepped forward, not into the past I had lost, but into the future I still had a chance to save. Epilogue, a new beginning. Weeks passed, and the house felt different. I sat at the dining table once more, but this time, it wasn't tense. Across from me, my son cautiously lifted his fork, eyeing me warily. I gave him a small smile. Want to try some of my toast? He hesitated before nodding. I cut a small piece and placed it on his plate. He took a bite, his lips twitching upward ever so slightly. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was progress. And beside me, Adrian watched silently, his expression unreadable. I didn't know what our future held, or if I could ever love him the way he might have once wanted. But I did know one thing, I would never be the mother my son feared again. And that was a start. The end.